Hi everybody, we're up to lecture 6 in 1st Isaiah, and today we're looking at Isaiah chapters 28 to 33. So I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to look at 5 separate texts within this section. And in chapter 28 we clearly come to a new section. The new section is a little bit longer than our study today, up to chapter 35, and it is bordered by 2 other collections. The so-called Isaiah Apocalypse of chapters 24 to 27 preceding it, and then it's followed by something that's going to be interesting to look at, a prose section which is historical narrative, and it's lifted a lot from the 2nd book of Kings. And that'll be interesting next time. So chapters 28 to 33 contain a series of 6 oracles which are similar to those in that very first collection we looked at, chapters 1 to 12. Most commentators say that the basics within this collection go right back to the prophet Isaiah himself, to those years 705 to 701 BC, the time of King Hezekiah, which is a whole generation after the time of King Ahaz in the earlier collection. Then that earlier collection, chapters 1 to 12, focused on the Syro-Ephraimite war, that coalition which was coming to attack Jerusalem of the 730s. Today's collection focuses on the time immediately prior to the Assyrian invasion of 701 BC under Sennacherib, the Assyrian leader Sennacherib. So a generation apart. Of course, we also know over the course of time, different editors added their own insights and their own prayerful observations, their own sense of theology, as the Jewish people move through different periods of their story. Jerusalem's destiny becomes a key theme, as do the intrigues and political maneuvers of the courtiers and officials at this time of incredible peril again for the Jewish people. As Joseph Blenkinsop puts it, these events clearly made a strong impact that could still be felt much later, when the city was in the process of rehabilitation after the exile, as the political and religious centre of the province, the new province of Judah. This checkered history is reflected and refracted in this section, which speaks of the refounding of the city, the defeat of those bent on its destruction, and the final annihilation of the anti-Jerusalem forces presented under the code name Assyria, the first of such designations, Babylon, etc., and Rome eventually in the New Testament. Ultimately, the deep struggle in these chapters is between the realpolitik of the Judean state and the demands of faith in the God who cares for us and watches over our destiny. And that's as Isaiah clearly puts it to us. That's his constant message, that the policies of the court and the officials are dangerous, misguided, because they leave God out of the equation. We also know from our studies of history that Jerusalem at this stage has become quite a wealthy state in the late 8th century BC, and the literati and cognoscenti of their day ridicule Isaiah as a prophet, and he rails against their willful failure to listen. He says they're drunk and blind and deaf and comatose. So, that's the background. Let's now look at 5 different passages within this. And the first is chapter 28, verses 1 to 13, the fate of Samaria and its leaders. The first 4 verses are a lovely little oracle in themselves. Woe to the haughty crown of Ephraim's drunkards, to the fading flower of its proud splendour, overlooking the lush valley, to those prostrated by wine. This wonderful little oracle, 4 verses, we've just read at the beginning of it, compares the fading flowers in the garlands worn by revellers, who are now truly inebriated, with the decadence of the fading glory of the once great capital city, Samaria, which sits right at the headland of a wonderful lush valley, the valley of Jezreel. And it's still today Israel's breadbasket. The city will be suddenly destroyed and, beautiful little image, just like a fig before summer comes, whoever notices it picks it, no sooner in the hand than swallowed. That's what's going to happen. Blenkinsop adds that the Hebrew text has some rather telling subtleties. The word fade can also mean stupid. And there are other examples he offers. It's a powerful little oracle about the judgment of Samaria. Then we move into verse 5 in this section, and we suddenly change atmosphere. We now have a crown of glory, a diadem of splendour, different from these garlands of drunkards. The imagery now becomes quite positive, and this noble headgear is for the remnant of Israel, those who will survive this time of judgment. And this eschatological promise to God's people is reinforced by, well, an allusion back to chapter 4, where the beauty and glory promised to the remnant are found again. And the phrase, the spirit of justice, is repeated. As Brevard Childs comments, we're meant to hold these verses together and understand more deeply the purposes of God, who both brings judgment and then salvation. Judgment to Samaria and salvation to the remnant. We move then into verse 7 to 13, and we recapture again the drunkard's theme, but in a really strong sense, a scene which probably goes back to a real confrontation between Isaiah and drunken courtiers. I find it incredibly vivid. You'd almost think you were there looking at it, listening to it. Who does he think he's lecturing? Who does he think his message is for? Babies just weaned? With his sav lasav, sav lasav. There's been a bit of discussion amongst the commentators about what that phrase means, and it probably is either with senseless gibberish, or it's the sound of kids repeating the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. The same senseless refrain over and over, now here, now there. Isaiah then observes, ironically, that the Lord's going to speak to his people in a foreign language, meaning the language of the Assyrian conquerors. That's who they're going to really hear, because they're not listening to Isaiah. They're not listening to his message of peace. They just don't get it. So they will get it one day when the Assyrians come. I'll just pass over chapter 28, verses 14 to 22, which continues the idea of scoffing courtiers and officials. And here it's the Judean leadership making deals with Egypt. Probably the idea of making a covenant with Mot, the god Mot, shows just how desperate these courtiers and officials truly are in adopting a rather decadent feast with its excess of drinking. Just a little point, there's a little phrase here which speaks about a precious cornerstone, a foundation stone. That's going to be spoken of by St. Peter in his first letter, which will identify this cornerstone with Jesus, the cornerstone of the community of faith. The second passage I want to spend a bit of time on is Isaiah 29, verses 9 to 14. Again, about the blindness of leaders and their empty worship. So we're continuing the previous theme of blindness, stupidity, inability to see, to listen. There is the strong suggestion that God ultimately is the cause of this blindness. On you, Yahweh poured a spirit of lethargy. He has closed your eyes, the prophets. He's veiled your hearts, the seers or visionaries. This spirit of lethargy is the very same word used when Adam slept and Eve was taken from Adam's side. And when Saul slept and David, who now realizes he's Saul's enemy, comes right up to him, the sleeping Saul, and takes his sword. It's the same word used when Jonah is asleep on the boat and the gale is tremendous and he's just peacefully asleep. It sort of suggests a mysterious mingling of the human motivation and the divine plan, which is how Isaiah must have understood the inexplicable folly and stupidity of these royal courtiers and officials. In verses 11 to 12, we have a later editor who comments about people who fail to open and read and understand the prophecies of Isaiah in their written form. The plain fact is that Israel no longer understands its own scriptures. And yet, in just a few short verses later, on that day, the deaf are going to hear the words of a book, and after shadows and darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. So it just invites us to meditate on the blindness and where true blindness really is. And in fact, those who are blind often can see better than those who can see. In verses 13 and 14, we come to these extraordinary words. Yahweh has said, because this people approaches me only in words, honours me only with lip service, while its heart is far from me, and my religion is nothing but human commands, a lesson memorized, then... So Matthew, of course, will use this text in his arguments between the Pharisees and Jesus. Chapter 15 of his Gospel. Hypocrites, says Jesus, it was you Isaiah meant when he so rightly prophesied. Isaiah, way back, can see how empty religion can become if the heart isn't truly in tune with God, if the heart is not open to God. And yet Yahweh has this response after all this. I will again do marvellous things with his people, wonderful, marvellous. Can God even enliven dead liturgy, perhaps? I'd just like to make a brief comment about the next passage, chapter 29, verses 15 to 24, a passage which we do read in the liturgy on the first Friday of Advent, because it speaks beautifully of the new creation God will accomplish. Giles makes this comment. God, who is so misunderstood by those who struggle with their petty political machinations and who discount the divine, is the one who will shortly demonstrate his true creative power to their detriment.